Welcome to Ethnic Studies program, Bound Bragg events that we're having for fall 20. And we're having a good list of speakers for this year. So this event, we're starting off with Dr. Timok Montoya, and he'll be talking about his recent publication, Unleashing Racism, the Classroom as a Space for Social Transformation Through Borderland Pedagogy. Dr. Timok Montoya is Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies, and he has a wide range of experiences on this topic, and he'll be sharing his recent findings. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Montoya to this conversation. So go ahead, Dr. Montoya.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for that introduction. And I'm glad to know that this is also being recorded. So for folks who might be watching this later on, welcome as well. First of all, I'm going to go a little bit backwards and thank Dr. Moreno for helping to organize this brown bag event. Also to thank the Ethnic Studies program for their continued support, and the folks that I work with in the program. And also, I just want to acknowledge for those of you who might be watching this at a different time or from a remote location, that I'm coming to you from Dene, Hopi, Wallapai, Havasupai, and Paiute lands, where Black Lives Matter. So like Dr. Moreno had mentioned earlier, is that this is a little bit of a different type of brown bag research talk, in that most research talks are done before publication, meaning that somebody is compiling research, putting things together, and then will present some of their findings and try to get feedback and comments and so on. In this case, I've already completed the article, and I'm not necessarily inviting feedback for the article in the sense of I want to better the article because the article has been published, but I certainly do welcome feedback, because this article is part of a larger project that I've been working on for several years, talking about issues of borderlands pedagogy and issues of within ethnic studies and the ethnic studies program in particular. So one thing I always like to sort of start with my discussions with is this issue of race and racism. And why I like to bring this up is because I think a lot of folks, particularly those who aren't versed within ethnic studies and have sort of an ethnic studies epistemology, is that talking about racism doesn't exacerbate any problems. Instead, it does the opposite, and it really moves towards this idea of how we can unlearn and hopefully abolish, and or at the very least move towards an anti-racist ideology. And I bring this up because one of the things I often talk about, particularly in the classroom, that I allude to in this particular article, but I don't really build upon necessarily, is this question of, does my race and ethnicity matter? And this is a question I ask to my students in the classroom all the time, in the sense of understanding what sort of perspectives and backgrounds I have, and what perspectives and backgrounds that I come from. And what's sort of interesting about this particular question, particularly in the classroom, is I get basically what folks can probably figure out are two different answers. No, it doesn't matter, because you're a learned person and you have studied this topic. Therefore, it shouldn't matter who you are as long as you understand the topic. Other folks will say, well, it does matter, because we're talking about race, ethnicity, racism, and so on. And we've already identified you as a so-called ethnic minority, a Latino person. And in this case, because you're an ethnic minority, it matters that you can come in with a particular perspective. And I move the conversation along in the classroom with not only talking about, does my race or ethnicity matter, but really moving the question further to, is it easier for me? And again, I get the same sort of question, like, no, it's not easier for you because it, again, you should know the topic. Other folks, well, again, you can talk to an experience, therefore it might be. And I point to my students that I had a conversation around this exact topic with a colleague at NAU by the name of Dr. Joel Olson, who taught in the political science department, a great colleague, a great mentor who passed away several years ago. And he taught abolitionist politics. He taught critical race theory, and he was a white guy. And in this conversation I had with him, he said, "No, Mark, it's easier for me as a white guy because I can go to the classroom, stand in front of the classroom, and talk about how racist this society is, how sexist it is, and so on. And I'm going to be taken as neutral and objective. You can say the exact same thing in the exact same way, and you could even articulate it a lot better than I could, but a majority of your class are going to take you as another minority complaining." And I was amazed by that sort of vision that he had, in the sense that when we do talk about racism, when it's coming from particular people, particularly people of color, people are often hesitant to listen to it because they see it as a biased sort of idea. And certainly it isn't, because I think the issue with that is that people tend to look at racism from solely an individual level. And what this research article is looking at is beyond that individual level of analysis, to look really at the structural, institutional, ideological, historical levels of analysis as well, that really, again, move forward with how we understand, how we talk about race and how we talk about racism in the United States as well. So with that in mind, I want to further move on and ask this what I feel is a very important preliminary question. And this is sort of the main research question that I had in the article, is how should we talk about race and racism in the US-Mexico borderlands? And the reason why I asked this particular question is because the US-Mexico borderlands is my primary field of study. So I often joke with people when I introduce myself in a sort of academic setting that I'm a recovering political scientist who teaches ethnic studies, who studies the U.S.-Mexico border, but also publishes primarily in education journals. So again, it really changes this particular dynamic of how we understand the world and some of the things that I do in particular. So when I ask this question, how should we talk about race and racism in the US-Mexico borderlands, my answer, and again, it doesn't have to be anyone else's answer, is borderlands pedagogy. Now, I'm assuming there's going to be a number of folks who aren't familiar with this word pedagogy, which is absolutely fine. But borderlands pedagogy is derived from a theory introduced by Gloria Anzaldúa. Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote the groundbreaking work called Borderlands La Frontera. And in this book, published in 1987, she argues that borderlands are not only observed, they are lived. In other words, what she's getting at is that not only are people navigating multiple geopolitical borderlands, but they're also navigating other borderlands, whether they be sexual, gendered, ability-based, and so on, right? So here in this case, the particular example. All right, great, thanks. In this particular example, then again, this idea that people tend to look at borderlands solely from a geopolitical lens, right? The U.S. and Mexico, right? The U.S. and Canada, France and Spain, and so on. And what she's saying is, okay, these borderlands exist, and these borderlands are very important in people's lives, but people who also live in borderlands are experiencing other borderlands, again, such as gendered, sexual, ability-based, and so on. So what we get at here is this sort of importance of intersectionalities in understanding how borderlands really affect how people are bordered in multiple ways and through multiple lenses. So with this in mind, we understand now borderlands are so much broader than a geopolitical space. But now let's get to pedagogy, right? Which is the method and practice of teaching. So again, my answer to the previous question is how do we talk about race and racism in the US-Mexico borderlands? We do this through borderlands pedagogy, through the method and practice of teaching about borderlands, right? And about the complexities of borderlands that exist in so many ways. So to sort of talk about the US-Mexico borderlands, we need to get to talking about that particular line, the line that separates the United States from Mexico in particular. And here I have a meme that I came across. It's meant to be satirical. So hopefully you all understand satire. This particular photo you see on the PowerPoint is the US-Canada border, actually. And in this case, you know, we don't see a wall, we don't see a fence, we don't see that same sort of narrative and discourse that we see happening in the US-Mexico border. And when I talk about the US-Mexico border, I actually like to share my particular story, and something that I mentioned in the research article as well, is that I didn't cross the border like a lot of my colleagues did on day one, meaning that a lot of my colleagues who study borderlands were crossing borders essentially at birth, right? You know, they're born on the US side and were taken to their grandparents in Mexico, or they're born in Mexico and were brought into the United States fairly quickly. My experience of crossing the border wasn't until I was 17 years old, and I basically did this as a tourist, right? But what's interesting was crossing the U.S.-Mexico border from El Paso, Texas, into Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. I imagined what Mexico was going to be like, right? I had an idea of Mexico, almost to the point where when I crossed the border, I expected to be greeted by an urgent sense of Mexican nationalism. I expected to be greeted by Mexican flags and mariachis, and, you know, playing the da 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 da, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I wasn't, right? Instead, I was greeted by little kids selling chicles, selling gum, and it was heartbreaking. It really was, because that's not what my expectation was. And I imagined returning home, like, you know, I'm going to go back to the homeland, to Mexico. And I realized quickly that I wasn't home in Mexico, right? I might be of Mexican descent, but it wasn't what I had imagined it to be. But then when I came back to the United States, I also realized, oh, wow, I'm not fully American either, right? So what we're talking about here is this, again, this borderlands pedagogy, this borderlands identity, whereby in this case, not only was I navigating a nation state identity, right? Mexican hyphen American, I was also navigating a racialized ethnic identity, Mexican hyphen American, right? And it was that sort of question, is how do I navigate this particular hyphen? Why is it that I not feel like a full Mexican when I'm in Mexico? And why is it that I don't feel like an American when I'm in the United States as well? And it really changes perspective on how I wanted to understand the world, and why I started studying the US-Mexico border, and really tried my best to tie it in to an ethnic studies perspective. So I'm not talking about that line, the US-Canada border. I'm talking about this line, this line, this line, this line. Now, and I will go back through these particular photos that I just went through fairly quickly. But again, keep in mind that border that you saw between Mexico, I'm sorry, between the United States and Canada, and now take in mind this line that's separating Mexico from the United States. It's a very different exterior. It's much more distressing, and again, it's much more marked and physical with these with the particular border in this case. For those of you who might be from Southern Arizona, you might be recognizing some of these photos as Nogales, Arizona. In this particular case, the part you see with the palm trees is the US side, on the other side of the wall is the Mexican side. Keeping in mind, and I have no idea if you can see my cursor that I keep moving around. But if you can, keep in mind that there's also in the distance of the wall Border Patrol truck, and also a watchtower as well. In other words, what I'm getting at here is that border walls themselves aren't just only the physical wall, but it's also the presence of people, border patrol. It's the presence of vehicles, presence of securitization, of drones, of again, watchtowers, and so on as well. And again, when you're looking at this particular exterior, we start to see a particular narrative that's built upon this building of a wall between two nation states as well. And in this case, we can see even the politicized graffiti in this particular slide. For those of you who speak Spanish, good for you. Or for those of you who can read Spanish, and if you can't, there's a bad word there, so we'll just go with that. And again, with this particular photo as well, where a young child who was murdered has a sort of memorial to him here as well. And again, that's a whole other story that we can get to, but it's not, again, necessarily the premise of my particular research in this particular article. To get back to Borderlands pedagogy, then, what the Borderlands do is they frame the stories we tell, the concepts that we draw upon, and the ways we frame the world, and the general pedagogical experiences we offer. Now, this is a lot, I understand, to unpack. So let me unpack exactly what I mean by this concept of Borderlands pedagogy, right? It frames the stories we tell, the concepts we draw upon, the way we frame the world, and the general pedagogical experiences that we offer. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that the classroom should not exist in isolation. In other words, it needs to be connected to this outside community. And how do we unlearn racism? Is that we have to start first by talking about racism. To ignore the problem is to do more damage than not. And again, to understand how we move towards unlearning, it's learning what this means and learning how we can move towards an abolitionist politics, if you will. And what I'm getting at this particular case, and really in this particular study, is this notion that I and many other scholars call the citizenship regime, right? So what I say here is, in understanding racism in the U.S.-Mexico borderland, we have to look at the rules of citizenship, right? In other words, what makes somebody a citizen of a particular nation state, and why are there so many other folks that are not considered citizens of that nation state as well? And we see, particularly in the United States, that citizenship has often been linked to wealth, has often been linked to land ownership, right? Has often been linked to gender, man, right? Has been linked to race, and so on. So for those of you who are constitution or emerging, I should guess, I'm assuming there's a lot of students here, are emerging constitutional scholars, let us not forget that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, while were very important, were not completely ratified or pushed forward until 1964 and 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts, respectively, as well. So this question of how citizenship plays into the role of how we understand race and racism, I think, needs to be acknowledged, and it really needs to be put on the forefront of how we understand racism again, because when we look back at the previous photos, right, we see that the discourse of citizenship is reinforced by that border wall very, very physically as well. And this is to ignore the historical presence, for example, of Chicanos, Chicanas, Chicanx folks, right? Mexican Americans in the borderlands, and it also completely ignores the historical precedents of indigenous folks in the borderlands as well. So we can say, at one point yes, what is now the US Southwest was indeed part of Mexico, but even before that, it was indigenous land and it'll always be indigenous land. So we can't forget that as well. So again, when we look at this notion of the citizenship regime, and hopefully you can see the map of the US-Mexico border and it's sort of superimposed behind this particular slide and notes, is I'm hoping you're asking this question to yourself, what does he mean by the citizenship regime? So I'll give you 4 things that make up the citizenship regime. First of all, there's the membership roles, right? The things that make somebody a citizen based on particular policies and laws, right? So there are particular membership rules that we have in the United States. They're actually quite simple. You're born in the United States, you're a citizen, right? Now, keep in mind there are folks who are wanting to revoke that, but it's basically that, or you can become a naturalized citizen, right? You can go through a particular legal process and then become a citizen, right? So there are rules to becoming a member. This creates the us, right? US citizens versus them, right? French citizens, Canadian citizens, Mexican citizens, and so on. Within the citizenship regime as well, though, we have to also take into consideration that there are particular rights and entitlements that we have from the nation state itself, right? So as citizens, we are granted particular kinds of rights. We have basically, and it's very simple rights as well. Basically, we have rights to vote, essentially. Again, this is very dependent on a number of other variables. Not everyone has a right to vote, not everyone has access to vote, and so on. But that's a right given to us from the nation state. But in addition to rights and entitlements that we get, there are also social expectations and responsibilities that we have as citizens. The most tangible one would be taxes, right? In other words, as citizens, we're expected and we have responsibilities to pay taxes and to basically be, as many say, and this starts to muddy the term a little bit of citizenship, to be good citizens, essentially. And then lastly, what makes a citizenship regime are the physical borders, right? The physical barriers that, again, separate nation states from each other. And in this case, as you can see sort of in the background of this particular map, we have the US-Mexico border. Keep in mind that this is a 2,000 mile long border. It's actually a pretty long border compared to a lot of other countries. I think Russia and China is a big border. Obviously, United States with Canada is going to be an enormous border as well. But in this particular map, this corner of it would be the eastern, no, the westernmost, yeah, the westernmost corner of Texas, where El Paso is, all the way down to the bottommost corner of Texas that sort of spills into the Gulf of Mexico. That itself is 1,000 miles, right? And that's a river. And in this case, we could argue it's a natural border, right? The river being sort of a natural barrier. The other half of the border is another 1,000 miles long, an irregular line drawn across the desert that again separates 2 nation states. Originally, basically a line in the sand. Nowadays, walls, drones, border patrol, and so on as well. And with this comes a very interesting and particular discourse on how we understand citizenship, and really how citizenship itself becomes tied to the notion of race in the United States. So my argument that I make in this particular research article is that the citizenship regime deals primarily in power. And those who have the power to define citizenship are generally the same ones who have the power to claim citizenship. So what I'm getting at here is that we have to understand sort of this issue of the racialization of identities, and also the racialization of who belongs and who doesn't. Who's the us and who's the them. Because let's not forget that in early colonial times, in what is now the United States of America, people from Ireland were not considered full citizens. Why were they not considered full citizens? Because they weren't considered white, right? Italians, so on and so forth. So again, we see that this is a policy tied to a weird conception of race, and also tied to conceptions of um, ownership, property, and economics as well. So what we're seeing here is this huge intersection of race and class. And then you tie to that issues of gender and women not being considered full citizens until 1920, and Black women not being considered full citizens until the 1960s. Again, this is not historically long ago, right? And I think this is sort of the importance that we have here when it comes to issues of understanding history. So again, those who have power can claim citizenship, and it is a relational relationship to power, and again, something to take into consideration. So the issue that I come across in this research article is that citizenship is not neutral by any means. We often overlook the ways in which citizenship is constructed, and we furthermore often overlook who gets to construct citizenship, right? So when we link citizenship to this notion of power, we see that various intersections all factor into who is not granted full citizenship rights and who is, right? So again, it's this it and some, and I'll put this out here as a disclaimer. There are some citizenship scholars that don't like the kind of research that I do, because they'll say, Dr. Montoya, you are muddying up the terms, right? Citizenship is a legal process that defines membership rules of the us versus them. And I say, yes, absolutely. But citizenship also is a muddy term, because not only does it determine the us and the them, but there's notions of what I think many of you here in the Zoom are probably familiar with, of not only sort of legal types of citizenship, but also what we call second-class citizenship, and the citizenship of folks who aren't fully welcomed into a particular society, right? In our past, we called it Jim Crow segregation. We called it black codes. We still, see redlining and so on and so forth, that all tie into who counts and who doesn't. And this is often tied to who has power and who doesn't. So I want to acknowledge that I am taking this concept of citizenship a step further than a lot of citizenship scholars would. So what I do in this particular research article is build upon a notion that I created called borderdom. It's certainly a play on words of boredom, but it goes beyond that as well. Because I think one thing when we're talking about borderlands and borders, we have to sort of understand particular distinctions that exist. A border is a line that surrounds and or separates particular areas. It is a very finite zone, essentially. Again, it's that physical line, in this case, that separates a nation state, like again, from Mexico from the United States. Whereas borderlands, which is a term I like to use, are vague, they're indefinite, they're outlying, they're transitional regions of a border, right? In other words, we can talk on the one hand that there is an effort to continue building walls between the US and Mexico on the actual line. But then there's this region that we know as a borderlands, whereby there are folks who are of Mexican descent that live in the United States, right? And they become themselves borderlanders, essentially. And when we look at this notion of sort of distinguishing borders from borderlands, I also have this suffix dom, D-O-M, right? The realm of jurisdiction or a state of being, right? A realm of jurisdiction, kind of like a kingdom, or a state of being, I'm sorry, such as freedom, right? So I conceptualize in this particular research article borderdom as both the realm of jurisdiction at or near a borderland, and as the condition of being bordered, right? In other words, the U.S.-Mexico border becomes a borderdom, and the issue of being bordered becomes a borderdom as well. And in this case, then it becomes clear to me anyway that if we go back to this idea of borderlands pedagogy, is that, as Gloria Anzaldúa had stated, is that we can't separate the lived experiences from border crossers, right? The sort of idea that, again, people are navigating multiple borders in their everyday lives. So this research article then comes across a number of themes, right? And these are, again, some important points, but I do fully understand that they might be also very analytical and theoretical. So I don't want to spend too much time on looking at these particular themes. But I want to spend enough time just to talk about how the citizenship regime itself has become more politicized, right? We see that it's become a major policy issue. Let us not forget that when President Trump announced his candidacy for president more than 4 years ago, his main talking points was at that point the US-Mexico border, and was at that point border crossers as well. I'm being really nice here. Let's not forget that when we define ourselves and others, we often do this through borders, right? This person is not American, this person is othered. We have to understand that citizenship, though, is also more than a restrictive category in which we place people. In other words, my argument in this particular research article is that citizenship is done by those four factors that I talked about: building physical borders, rights and entitlements, um, expectations, and membership roles. But at the same time, when we ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a citizen? Being a citizen is also contradicting the things that make the citizenship regime, right? So on the one hand, citizenship is more than just the essence of the nation state. It is also the challenge to the nation state. So when we hear of folks trying to ban ethnic studies, for example, when we hear of folks trying to push forth a so-called US patriotic education, a good citizen, I would argue, challenges those particular notions, right? Borderdom shows how individuals negotiate physical barriers as well as confront the symbolic meanings of borders, right? We have to confront the meanings behind racism. That's a border, right? Homophobia, a border. Transphobia, a border, right? And that confrontation itself, in my argument, builds upon the cultural citizenship literature to say that itself, when you confront these barriers, is citizenship, and it's citizenship done in a way that citizenship ought to be done. So here we have again the map of the US-Mexico border. And I talk about this in this research article as well, because this is the map that I show my classes when I show them the map of the US-Mexico border. And I always have a student raise their hand and say, "Hey, Dr. Montoya, your slide's upside down." And my response is it? I mean, how do we know what's up and what's down, and so on and so forth? It becomes a really interesting conversation about human constructs, social constructs, how we understand the meaning of the world, and so on. But really, what the purpose is not really so much to talk about social construction and so on, but to sort of ask yourself, what is your brain trying to do right now? And what your brain, I'm guessing, and I'm only guessing because this is the conversation I've had with the majority of my students, is as they say, it's trying to flip it back. It's trying to make it right. See what I'm getting at here? So again, in this particular sense, is that whenever we offer alternatives to, again, racism, people, it's this sort of alternative of people say, I'm not racist, I'm a non-racist. I'm like, again, you go back to that great quote. It's not enough to be non-racist. What we have to do is be anti-racist, right? There has to be a clear distinction of understanding how we, again, see the world and understand the world as well. And again, whenever I bring in these concepts of anti-racism, unlearning racism, and so on, so many students still want to make it right? How do I flip it back the way I understand it? And the point is, maybe we shouldn't be trying to understand it in the way it's always been given to us. because the way it's always been given to us seems to not have worked, and maybe we have to sort of re-examine our understanding of the world by not necessarily always just flipping it on its head. That's a little bit too simplistic, but at the same time understand the complexities about why we understand the world the way we do, right? What are the things that have happened historically, institutionally, ideologically, that are affecting things today, right? And how do we move beyond that individual level of analysis to talk about larger structural issues as well? And I think the hesitation that so many people have with talking about race and racism and trying to unlearn racism is that they personalize it. So again, they see a critique of white supremacy as a critique on whiteness. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm critiquing. I'm not critiquing folks who have white skin. I am critiquing a system. Just like when I critique patriarchy, I'm not critiquing men, I'm critiquing a system that happens to also privilege men. So again, it's how do we take a systemic institutional ideological approach to understanding and historical approach to understanding why the world is the way we understand it today as well. So the issue here is that the US-Mexico border is no longer just a line in the sand, but as I mentioned, it's a wall, it's a fence, it's drones, it's national security at its highest levels, and it's complex. And in order to understand these complex dynamics, we should underscore unique forms of border wall discourse and the inherent racism that accompanies it. In other words, we have to pay attention to what people are saying when they talk about building walls and how that becomes a very racialized type of discourse, right? And when we look at the issue and the problem that I have with the traditional view of the citizenship regime, we see that it ignores cultural identity and political mobilization as forms of citizenship, and instead remains a political strategy used to validate, strengthen, and reinforce racial hierarchies. Again, we cannot separate a racialized hierarchy within the building of walls and border discourse. Now, um, keep in mind that while it might seem that I'm being critical of the current presidential administration, that his policies are building upon Barack Obama's policy, who was often referred to as the deporter in chief, given his deportation policies, which build upon George W. Bush's policies, which built upon Bill Clinton's policies. Again, I'm not as angry with particular individuals who have been president of the United States as I am with the system of power that they have all used to, again, reinforce and validate and strengthen a racialized hierarchy that has already existed um, here in the United States. So again, the issue is not the individual necessarily per se, the issue is the system. I'm having an issue with the systemic problem of the citizenship regime. So when we move these kind of conversations into the classroom, I build upon this particular argument that says border pedagogy must take the dual task of not only creating new objects of knowledge, but also addressing how inequalities of power and human suffering are rooted in basic institutional structures. In other words, what I'm arguing in this paper, as educators, we should prepare students as citizens. And to prepare them as citizens is to prepare them to challenge what citizenship is. Because once you challenge what citizenship is, you're not only claiming to be a non-racist, you're now claiming to also be an anti-racist. You are taking agency and moving actively towards changing these particular dynamics as well. And what we need to also take into consideration is, unfortunately, a lot of these border crossing metaphors, especially in terms of anti-immigrant sentiment, has had a very long history, right? I see Dr. Binod here. So hi, Dr. Binod. Um, I'm sure, and even with Dr. Moreno's classes, if any of his students are here, I'm sure in both of those classes, I don't see anyone else. So my apologies if I'm leaving anyone out. if you're taking ethnic studies courses by any of us in ethnic studies, you've heard and read about and have probably talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So there's been precedent where anti-immigration sentiment was based on race and ethnicity, right? In this case, against Chinese. There has been historical precedent whereby anti-immigration sentiment was uh, based on particular social and political ideologies, right? Against communists, for example, or against folks coming from communist countries, depending on how they were coming and why they were coming. Because what's interesting about folks fleeing communism, depending on where they're coming from, sometimes they would be counted as refugees, other times they'd be counted as immigrants. So that's a long history there as well. And we've seen a historical precedent even along the lines of health. Precedent trying to stop folks with tuberculosis, and in this case now COVID-19. So the point I'm trying to make here again is that even if we move beyond political and social ideologies, or even when we're talking about health concerns, is a lot, if not most, of our anti-immigration sentiment hasn't necessarily been based on ideologies or health, but instead has been based solely on issues of race and ethnicity. Who counts and who doesn't? Who was welcome and who is not? For those of you who are interested in history, read some of the anti-Irish sentiment that was happening in early colonial times. Read about the anti um, uh, Italian sentiment written by Irish folks, right? Again, it's quite interesting that there's even a domino effect of anti-immigration policies that happen. Some of the most anti-Mexican immigrant folks that I know are themselves of Mexican descent, right? They start to buy in to this idea of difference. This is what folks call ethnic racism, when you have sort of a racism between amongst your own group and within your own group of people as well. And a lot of this, again, has to do with fear, right? For most Americans, the US-Mexico border remains dangerous, it's unsecure, and citizenship also remains white, right? Again, let's think about it. There are hordes of Central Americans coming. They're rapists. They are bringing in crime. They're bringing in drugs, right? It's a discourse that's created to, again, build upon fears that people already have of the other, right? And this is because borders are exclusive. And borders are exclusive at the expense of conquest, at the expense of colonization, and at the expense of imperialism. So the other thing we also have to take into consideration when we study borderlands is that borderlands studies themselves, the borderland studies itself isn't an old discipline, but the nation state system that creates borders itself isn't that old, right? If we go back to the Treaty of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War and the creation of the modern, so-called modern nation state, that was only 370-ish years ago, right? When we look at the borderlands of what is now the continent of Africa, we have to understand that was conquest, colonization, and imperialism, because a lot of those borders themselves were not naturally occurring, and it cut ethnic groups in different ways as well. Same with other colonists borders in Southeast Asia, other Asian countries, and so on. That again, we can't forget the effects of borderlands being a part of conquest and colonization, including the US-Mexico borderland, right? Manifest Destiny, the US-Mexico War, the relocation of indigenous people, and so on and so forth. So when we look at this particular discourse of fear, I just want to argue that we're at a critical moment right now, right? Because it's about the coded language against migrants, refugees, and Black and Indigenous people of color, right? And we have to understand that racism is still racism, regardless of how it occurs. So there's some really great research out there about what folks call colorblind racism, right? That racism that is as harsh as this sort of old Jim Crow racism, the overt racism that existed in the past. And it reminds me of this quote that I'm probably going to get wrong, by Malcolm X, that was basically, "Don't stab me in the back, pull it out halfway and call it progress," right? Because you might pull it out halfway and call it progress, but you've already stabbed me in the back, right? So that's that sort of subtle colorblind racism that so many people like to see they have, right? I'm not racist, right? I'm not racist, but, or that my intention wasn't to be racist. And again, my argument would be is that I understand as an individual, right? I'm not making an individual judgment that as an individual you might be a really good person, but um I we live in a racialized racist society. And again, to go back to that other quote, it's not enough to be non-racist. We have to be anti-racist, right? It's not enough to be non whatever else. We have to be anti whatever that particular oppression is, as well. And really, again, it gets back to this us versus them versus us kind of ideology that starts to occur. And this is a an old cartoon from La Cucaracha that I think this is 1994. And I think it really speaks to this idea of how folks really misunderstand issues of race and racism, and sort of connect it to other sort of national identities and so on. And in this, we see uh, the first panel of the cartoon where I see, in my opinion, two Chicanos, right? Maybe let's say a dad and his daughter, and the dad says to his daughter, "Let's get out of here. There's too many wetbacks." And then the panel, goes, pulls back from that particular um, uh, uh, image. And then we see Uncle Sam, and he says, "Good Lord, look at all those wetbacks," right? The point being, in this case, is there's an internalized racism, right? And then there's the racism that says, "Oh no, but you're all the same," right? We're not even seeing any sort of difference here as well. And then on the very bottom, and I don't know if anyone can see it, the artist writes, "Why should anyone say wetback," right? So just FYI for students here, I'm using that word for educational purposes, but I certainly not encourage you to utilize that word in everyday conversation, because it is quite derogatory term. And what we get at then is this issue of, when we talk about borderlands identities and education, are implications, particularly in participation in Arizona state institutions. I borrowed that particular slide and this one from folks who were very active in the Tucson Unified School District after the banning of ethnic studies. So if there's anyone from that particular crew on here, thanks for always sharing your work with other folks. But these data implications and participation in Arizona state institutions, and this is again a little bit old data, but we can see in Arizona, at least 57% of the population is white in this turquoise color, 4% African American, 31% Mexican American, 5% Native American. I think the numbers have changed, not too significantly, but significantly enough. But we also see the issue here, and the red being the population of these ethnic subpopulations in Arizona state universities, and the DOC, for those who don't know, would be Department of Corrections. So basically, the percentage of them represented in prisons and jails, right? So if we lived in an equal and just society, the argument here should be that the population of whites in universities should also be around 37%, and the population of whites in prisons should also be around 37%. But it's not, right? There's there's a huge discrepancy. But when we look at African Americans, Mexican Americans, we see it's even bigger discrepancy, whereby Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans are overrepresented in departments of correction, right? In prisons and jails, and sort of even along the idea of criminalization of the other, right? The criminalization that happens of particular racialized identities in the state that we call Arizona. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because it's connected to what we call the school to prison pipeline. Here's another often used um, graph that shows Mexican American educational attainment in the United States, and I believe this is 2016. If we have Mexican Americans make up a particular segment of our population, we'll ratio it down to 100 students. Of those 100 students, 46 will graduate from high school. 46 Mexican American students, mind you, will graduate from high school. Already more than half of Mexican Americans in the school system don't graduate from high school. That's already absurd to me, right? Again, I'm an educator, so I value education, and not to say I don't value vocational education and other forms of education. I think when people have the choice, that's a good choice. If that's a choice somebody wants to make. But at the same time, this doesn't have to do with choice as much as it has to do with dropout rates and push out rates, right? Students are being pushed out as well. 26 will enroll in college. 8 will graduate with a bachelor degree, 2 will earn a graduate or professional degree, and 0.2 will graduate with a doctoral degree, right? So what am I getting at here? So what I'm getting at here is that if you add myself and Dr. Moreno with being of Mexican descent and having doctoral degrees, we still don't count as a full person. We still don't count as a full person based on this 0.2 data, right? And again, there's something to be said on why prisons, education, schooling, borderlands identities, citizenship, so on and so forth become interconnected with each other, right? And the historical precedents of race and racism as well. So the thing is, I often hear people say, well, what we need to do is we need to reform the system, right? We need police reform. We need prison reform. We need immigration reform. And I say there's a problem with reform, me personally, and this article does as well, that we need to deal with the systemic issues of citizenship and hence with racism. In other words, for example, immigration reform is not going to get rid of racism. It's not going to get rid of vigilante groups. It's not going to get rid of citizenship as a regime, right? So oftentimes, again, it's too much, in my opinion, focus on reforming as opposed to dealing with systemic issues, right? The systemic issue of citizenship, the systemic issue of racism. And we get back to this question here of becoming and being anti-racist, right? So I say here, unlearning racism necessitates anti-racism, not non-racism, right? Again, good for somebody for not being a racist, right? You know, I'm not a racist. I didn't wear a sombrero to and a fake mustache to Cinco de Mayo, right? I'm a good person. And again, I'm like, okay, that's great. That's a good step. Non-racism is a good step. But now, how are you going to be anti-racist? How are you going to, again, tear down those particular aspects that create these issues in the ways that they do? So to sort of circle back to this concept then of borderdom is that borderlands pedagogy, as I argue, lends itself to the conscious decolonization of academia. And consequently, it leads to decolonization of citizenship. In other words, when we talk about education, we talk about the classroom, when we talk about talking about racism, we have to understand that academia itself also needs to be decolonized, right? In order to decolonize academia, that would further lend us to the decolonization of citizenship. Now, here's the thing, right? And here's the really difficult challenge is we have to take into consideration that decolonization and sometimes anti-colonization itself, right? Similar to anti-racism, is not an easy process, right? And that's sort of the difficult thing as well. So I often have students ask me like, what should I do and how should I go about it? And I want to, do a PhD program in ethnic studies. I'm like, that's great. This is really good stuff. Let's not forget that the academic system itself was built on colonization, that the academic system itself was built on giving us particular knowledge in some forms, but not giving us other knowledge in other forms. I'll give you an example. Um, in high school, in my, might have even been my senior year, uh, I'm trying to think of back to some of my English and literature courses. I can't recall any of my literature courses, including in the state of New Mexico, right, the state next door to Arizona, that has a high population of Latinos in that state. We might even be more than half, or we're near half the population. I don't recall reading any Latinos. I don't recall reading any Black folks, and so on, until my senior year, where we read an excerpt of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. Now, keep in mind, it was an excerpt, because what happens is that Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech is often taken out of context as well, right? The judging people by the content of the character, not the color of their skin. Again, a very beautiful speech, a very beautiful sentiment, and him saying, this is what I wish for, but this is not where we're at, right? So he becomes quite misquoted. But I get the sort of um, amended version of that particular speech, and then we get to talk about, and when I was in high school, of how racism's been solved, right, essentially. And it's not until college that I'm introduced to Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, which is a very different Martin Luther King, a very different sentiment of what race is in the United States, what racism is, what citizenship is, what belonging is, and what existence is, right? So again, when we're looking at this issue of borderlands pedagogy, we have to understand that academia itself has to be decolonized. So this is when I challenge folks, and I'm not saying this because I'm in ethnic studies and I have my ethnic studies colleagues here as well, but when I talk about sort of the importance of ethnic studies, when I have students come to me at the end of the semester and say, wow, I did not know this. I wish I would have learned this in high school. In my class this afternoon, my Intro to Chicano Studies course, we talked about the landmark Mendez versus Westminster court case that helped desegregate schools in California. And I said, this was a legal precedent set prior to Brown versus the Board of Education. And I told him, I want you to know Brown versus the Board of Education. That is really important. I want you to know that it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. I want you to know that it helped desegregate schools. But I also want you to know that there were a number of cases that predated that, also in the Mexican American community, that helped undo the racism that had occurred previously. And again, it's to understand the complexities of what we're taught and what we're often not taught, right? What's left out of the particular story. We think back, Columbus Day was Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, but Columbus Day was a couple of Mondays ago. And sort of the move towards Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm like, that's a great sentiment, but now what are we going to do, right? So it's not enough to just say we're changing the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Now what are we going to do to, I don't know, reparations, land back? I mean, there's a whole other process of decolonization that has to be, I think, part of that particular process, right? It's not enough, again, to just change something symbolically. We have to do something about it and decolonize this notion of racism, citizenship, and so on. Another sort of example to take into consideration, sort of related to this concept of Columbus Day, when I was talking to my students about it a couple of Mondays ago, was what they were taught in school, right? And I got comments again. I was taught in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I was taught about the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I was taught about circumventing the globe, that he was trying to prove the world is round, even though most people had already known that. Other folks will know he's trying to find a passage to India, and so on, right? All these stories. And again, I'm like, oh, well, what it's quite interesting that we're given what, a Eurocentric version of history, because ask indigenous folks their version of Christopher Columbus, and it's not exploration and discovery, it's conquest and slavery, right? It's the same person, it's a different perspective on history, and not even a different perspective, it's a fuller perspective on history. I asked them about George Washington, and I asked my students, you've heard the stories about his wooden teeth, right? And, a few people are like, oh yeah, I've heard that he had wooden teeth. And I'm like, no, he had teeth from slaves, right? Nobody wants to talk about that, but we have to acknowledge the history that we have, acknowledge the history where we're at. We have to acknowledge the history, for example, that my granddad, who was a World War II veteran, was at Normandy, and sort of even the issues around war and conquest and so on, which itself could be problematic. But he comes back to the United States and isn't allowed in certain parts because he's half indigenous, right? His mother was a indigenous Pueblo woman from Laguna Pueblo, New Mexico, right? That he did not count as a full citizen, right? This sort of idea that, yes, you count here, but now that you're back in the United States, you're mixed race, you're something other, you're not a full citizen. So it comes with a lot of complexities and a lot of issues, as well, to get us to particular suggestions that I have for all of you that are here today. So again, thank you all for joining me. Is that we need to self-reflect. We have to investigate our own privileges, and we have to understand that our own privileges are tied to particular systems, right? I have particular privileges in this world. Yes, I'm an ethnic minority, but I'm also a man who presents himself as a man who is in a heterosexual relationship, right? So there are things that I can do, like I teach a class on Tuesday nights that ends at 6:30. It's getting dark at 6:30, but as a male-bodied person, I'm not thinking when I walk from the building to my car of sexual assault. I have male privilege in that sense, right? And it's based on a system. It's not based on me being a man. It's based on a system that privileges men, right? I can hold my partner's wife in my partner's hand in public without being feared, getting homophobic slurs or getting beaten or whatever, right? Because we're in a heterosexual relationship. Other folks don't have that privilege, right? I can. I had to move to a new house this summer. If I had anybody who is not able-bodied and needs a wheelchair, this particular person would not be able to visit me without going to the back of the house because there's steps, right? So I have able-bodied privilege, right? So again, it's a system, and we have to investigate and self-reflect on these privileges that we have. We also have to make sure that we decenter ourselves, to not talk over or to not talk for other people, right? For me to say, I can only speak to my experience, and I know there are intersectional oppressions that exist, but it's not up to me to talk about necessarily gender, sexuality, and so on, because that's not my identity, right? We have to also be willing to make mistakes, and we have to understand we might fail sometimes. But we have to also understand that when we're called out, it can be an act of love. In other words, it's a sort of idea that people are helping us to, again, be anti-racist, be anti whatever that is, right? Oh, wow, I did not know that. Thank you for letting me know. And finally, intersectionality is not here for our comfort, right? If it's difficult, you're doing it right. So this is the point, I guess, where I can open it up, and I know there's just a little bit of time left, but open it up to a discussion if there are any questions or comments. I do know there's a huge difference between writing a journal article, having that published, and sort of presenting it, because there's so much information that you can only present in an article, but so much more that you want to talk about in a presentation. But I certainly do welcome that. And I think I saw Dr. Bernode with his hand up. Yes.
First, Dr. Montoya, thank you for a very insightful presentation. In fact, I mean, the concept of this borderland is very interesting, as many, scholars, including Homike Bhabha, Emma Gloria, and Anzaldúa, they define this as a third space, right? Very interesting and useful concept. And I missed the first 10 minutes. Like, I think we discussed this borderland pedagogy, but I'm really interested in this pedagogy. And having said that, I do have a question. I mean, do you see any implication of this pedagogy to teach courses like global diversity? For example, I just taught a class, this course, global race and ethnic relations, where we discuss caste system in India, right? And then we try to compare caste system with race and racism here in the US in terms of discrimination and segregation, right? Because, both of these are forms of oppression. And it seems to me like it is very important for us to have a conversation about caste is equally, condemnatory practices as race in a global context, right? So said that, how can we use this borderland pedagogy to teach, courses like this one? And number one. Number two, I mean, how would you differentiate this borderland pedagogy, this concept, from post-colonial approach? I mean, this post-colonial approach is the one I'm utilizing in this course.
So two questions here. Again, how does this fit in, what I'm hearing, into a sort of global race and ethnic relations kind of course, but just sort of global studies, I think, in general? And then how is this different from post-colonial? I'm going to answer the last one first and say that it's not different from post-colonial sort of research, and Anzaldúa, Homi Bhabha, and all these other folks that you even mentioned are quite on the same page when it comes to understanding these particular arguments as well. I would say that some folks, and again, like Anzaldúa passed away several years ago, so she wasn't able to build upon her work. We're focused again on a decolonial model. And what I think newer scholars are pushing towards is not only a post-colonial, decolonial model, but also itself an anti-colonial model. And anti-colonial, again, not being something that you're against it because it's bad, but you're filling in the holes that the colonial model left out. So I would certainly not see too much of a difference in that sense. That broadly speaking, if I were to see somebody's literature review and they broke down the literature very specifically into post-colonial literature, and I saw Gloria Anzaldúa there, I'd say that's great. That's where she belongs as well. So certainly. But you bring up this really great question about, again, this particular global race and ethnic relations class, but also, again, the issue of global studies. And this reminds me of, and I think we had some of this conversation in our staff meeting the other day as well, is for students here, and this really affects you all as students, is that NAU is looking to revise its liberal studies program, right? And a number of you as students have to take particular classes that fit under liberal studies. Other universities call it general education, and so on, that there are sort of core foundational courses that we ought to take. And as part of those core foundational courses, there are also what we call US and ethnic diversity courses and global diversity courses, right? So global race and ethnic relations, obviously, in my opinion, would be probably fulfilling for some of you students the global diversity requirement. So we understand as professors that some students only take our courses to fulfill a requirement, but we also hope you get something out of it as well, because it is quite important. And the way I see Borderlands pedagogy is that it really, again, clears up this distinction between a so-called global perspective and a national perspective, right? The difference between sort of the US ethnic diversity and the global ethnic diversity. And again, Dr. Vinod, I think you speak a lot to this in your research, in your writings, and probably in your classes as well, is that if you're going to be talking about, for example, the Asian American experience, right? First of all, we already know Asia is huge, right? That's more than half the world is considered Asian, whatever that means, right? Just population-wise, territory-wise, all these kinds of things, right? So there's a number of assumptions just there. But and again, to talk about the so-called Asian American experience is to also talk about what? The Asian experience, right? Like we can no longer, in Chicano studies, for example, and Latino studies, for example, as well, I can't only talk about Latinos who happen to only live in the United States, because I also have to talk about Latin America and Latin American history and colonization and push-pull factors and all these kinds of things. That what I think borderland studies do is it really brings in the focus that the local is the global, right? I mean, I don't want to sound like a bumper sticker, but that local and global politics are so intermeshed with each other, right? And I think Borderlands pedagogy also speaks to the issue of indigeneity and indigenous sovereignty as well, because on the one hand, we can look at indigenous peoples in the United States as particular global actors, right? In other words, they become sovereign nations within a colonized nation as well. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers that particular question, but basically the crux of the answer is that Borderlands really understands that local and global politics are so intertwined with each other that we can't talk about one thing without talking about the other thing, right? I can't talk about Central American migration to the United States without also talking about the movements in the 70s and 80s of US imperialism in those Central American countries that pushed people out and continue to this day to push people out as well. So yeah, I think it's a great conversation, and certainly we can continue it offline, but knowing your work, I've always seen in your presentations and in your work, Dr. Minoda, a lot of overlap in terms of when I hear, I'm like, oh, that's Borderlands, and I write something down, and hopefully you did some of the same things, like, oh yes, this is not too dissimilar, because it does mesh with each other, I think, really well. Thank you for that question, or those questions.
Do you have any questions?
Okay, I have a couple questions. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
You probably address this probably in another chapter you're working on, article, is that where you're looking at Latinos and Mexicans fit in the borderlands of the Midwest and East Coast and the Deep South, because of the, historically, the last 20 years, Mexicans always had settlements in the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest, and then small pockets in the South. But now in the last 30 years, you have more migration of those pockets of people, because the population demographics have changed. How do those people fit in the borderlands that is non-historical, like, beyond the Southwest? How will those people fit in, settling in those areas? And, how will you fit into the borderland perspectives or pedagogy?
Yeah. And that's a great question. So thank you for asking that. So it sort of reminds me again of the difference between, as I mentioned previously, in this particular presentation, the difference between a border and a borderlands. And using the concept of a borderland really allows me to play with this idea that in order to study Mexican Americans and other Latinos in, say, the Northwest or the Midwest of the United States, is that we're looking at them through a borderlands lens, meaning that the borderlands extends way beyond just the physical U.S.-Mexico border to as far as Maine and north and as far south as Chiapas. In other words, this whole continent, two continents, right, of the Americas, if we call now the Americas, are a borderlands in a particular extent. And it sort of reminds me, Dr. Moreno, is also the one of the most recent books that our colleague, Dr. Jerry Garcia, had written in looking at folks in Washington State, right? And if I remember correctly, he subtitled it the northern borderlands, right? Something along those lines. And I was actually very appreciative that was a subtitle, because he was really bringing in this notion, in my opinion, that the borderlands doesn't always have to be that physical border that separates the United States from Mexico, but that people are living, Mexicans, for example, in his book, in Washington State, and are still separated from a border, even though that border that's closest to them is Canada, not Mexico, because they are a racialized group of people, right? And I think, again, it's that sort of notion of how we understand and conceptualize borders versus borderlands. So hopefully that answers that question. But there, and again, and it goes back to a lot of the research you and others are doing in looking at the consequences of being Chicano, Chicanx, Chicana, Latino, Mexican, Mexican American, etc., in the Midwest and in the Northwest. Because the thing is even though the U.S.-Mexico border is further away, they never stop being Mexican. They never stop being what that identity is, right? So it really, I think, that it really does push forth this notion of borderlands, because they're still, even though they might be in Michigan, are still negotiating that border, because they might have an accent, they might have a certain skin color, they might have a certain occupation, they might have a certain kind of last name, and so on and so forth. So the border is always there, right? And I can only guess that places that you've lived in probably have more border kind of neighborhoods. I'm guessing, and I haven't been to some of those places, but some places in the Midwest that have growing populations of Mexicans and Mexican Americans probably now have mercados, and there's probably now stores that sell quinceañera dresses and Mexican candies and so on and so forth, because the border has now followed these people, because that's what their culture is. So yeah.
Yeah, because I go to Chicago, it's like LA now. Mexican group. I go to Detroit, it has a historical community southwest, and then I lived in East Lansing. It had maybe 3 stores. You go to Mexican stores, population smaller there, but they have the Tejano diaspora. See, they have identified as Tejanos because they go back from South Texas and migrate back into Michigan and so on. So yeah, so they had that Tejano diaspora, and they're a little different out there. And then it was their experience from coming from California and going out to the Midwest, the way they acted and behaved, socially.
Right. And you bring up a great point. And one thing that I didn't even think about is that I sometimes use this term Latino, Latinx, Latina, and so on. And we have to understand, like what we were talking about with Asian American and so on, this is a huge umbrella term, right? So very interestingly, parts of Chicago are more reminiscent of Mexican communities and Mexican American communities, whereas it seems that even parts of Detroit some of it might be Mexican, but some of it might be Puerto Rican, and some of it might be Mexican American. And then in the case of East Lansing, some of it is very specific, right? Tejano is what you said? Tejano, so Texans, that Texan Mexicans, which is again, its own very unique kind of culture there as well. I mean, to the point whereby I had a friend whose last name was Figueroa, and I asked if he was a Californian, and he's like, "How'd you know I was from California?" I'm like, "Well, A, your accent, but B, your name's Figueroa, and that's really common in the state of California. It just is." So even within the community, we kind of start to know where folks are from and how they identify. Me being from a rural town and from northern New Mexico and so on and so forth. Those of you who study Latino studies, Chicano studies, and know New Mexico is going to be a very interesting, diverse group of people who often tie themselves back to a so-called imagined Spanish identity as opposed to a Mexican one, which itself is problematic. But people who do Chicano studies know that difference between a California, Texas, Mexican, Central American, Caribbean, so on and so forth, sort of identity that exists as well. So it does speak to the unique diversity even within the groups. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, any more questions before we end it tonight's presentation? Any other discussions? Okay, thank you, Dr. Montoya, for joining us in our first event of the year. Also, on this November 5th, we have another colleague, Jessica Turf, to talk about her work on Detroit, looking at environmental issues and other prosperity issues going on in there. And so join us for that event. So thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you.